Hello and a warm welcome to this week's edition of Invest Africa. I'm Godfrey Mutizwa, standing in for Alicia Sekam. Now, despite growth in Western markets, private equity continues to make a buzz in emerging and horizon markets. And some say Africa in particular represents a colossal investment opportunity for private equity. The continent has exceeded world average growth for the past 8 years and is now the fastest growing region in the world. Let's take a look at this report.
Due to a lack of fundraising in businesses, private equity has become a lucrative option for businesses. According to Emerging Markets Private Equity Association, the share of global private equity fundraising is said to have multiplied from 5% in 2003 to 20% last year. This has seen Africa as an investment destination for private equity investments.
Private equity is really important in the region because our public markets, particularly outside of South Africa, are so thin. And so capital that's coming into the region is very often coming through non-publicly listed companies and through private equity, which very often is a great startup way of getting funded for companies and therefore very, very good in terms of employment creation.
According to the Emerging Markets Private Equity Association survey, Sub-Saharan Africa climbed to the number 5 slot on the Emerging Markets Attractiveness Index in the past year, from 7th place in 2011. Fundraise from the region also grew to $1.4 billion last year, from $1.3 billion the previous year, but still far below a 2008 peak.
When you take a look at private equity as an asset class, is gaining a lot of momentum and popularity in Africa at the moment. And the reason why it's so important, right, for the growth of most economies in Africa is actually because of the fact that the international outlook or the ownership of most private equity funds, the GP funds, is such that will help develop, first of all, the key management talent issues that we have in Africa, number one. Number two, it is clear that the growth, there's so much growth in Africa, but it is clear that, most African governments or even the public sector cannot fund all of those growth.
Private equity has become among the more preferred financing models, whereas banks have been the traditional financiers and founded mostly on loan interest and service fees. This type of funding aims to ensure that businesses grow, as investors only make money when businesses gain value. According to the World Bank, Africa needs $93 billion per year over a decade to improve infrastructure, and private equity companies can provide the cash injections needed to revive ailing businesses and spur job creation.
Joining me now on the desk to take a closer look at the state of private equity on the continent is Warren Watkins, partner at KPMG Private Equity Markets, Luke Albinskis, and managing partner at Vantage Capital, and Nuno Xavier, private equity executive at Africa Alliance. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Let's just take a broader look first. Everybody speaks about Africa being in a special zone. Some people talk about Africa being in a sweet spot, if you like, because of the convergence of faster growth rates, a very, very big consumer market by some standards, and growing interest into the continent. Let me start with you, Warren. Are we seeing the same kind of interest and focus on Africa as we are seeing at the broader numbers around Africa's faster growth rate?
Godfrey, I think we are. The current general view is that maturing markets have stalled in terms of growth, in some instances negative or very small growth. South Africa, for instance, sitting at about 2 to 3% growth, and the average for Africa is now forecast in the region of 8. That's attracting a lot of interest. And the private equity market or the private equity players are usually the first to jump at an opportunity like this.
Right.
And in all of our surveys and discussions with the various private equity players, a portion of their funds has been allocated for Africa.
Right. How long has this growth been going on? Because we know that this economic expansion started quite a long way back. I think I remember reading somewhere that since 2000, actually, 27 of Africa's 30 biggest economies have been in positive territory, suggesting that this growth rate has actually been going on for a long time. Has that also been matched in terms of the pace of the growth in the private equity industry?
I think, Godfrey, that the pace has accelerated in the last couple of years. You've had some very large funds come into this African market.
Right.
People like Actis, more recently Carlyle, looking actively at private equity opportunities. So I think the pace has accelerated. There's more capital that's being applied to the continent. But I think a lot of constraints on deals and on company growth remain.
Right.
And I would argue that some of this private equity news is overhyped at the moment when it comes to Africa.
Why would you say that?
Because I think that when one looks at the track record of successful private equity on the continent,
Yeah.
I think one points to a small number of very successful transactions which perhaps overshadow a broader group of fairly mediocre deals. I also think that in some respects, South Africa's private equity performance is very creditworthy. I mean, the South African private equity funds, the Braits, who have now exited, unfortunately, this market, but the Ethoses and other funds have generated exceptional returns over a long period of time. So as much as one can get very excited about African growth rates, I don't think one should ignore our local market either.
Absolutely. Let me come to you, Nino. So certainly, last but not least, they are talking positively about an acceleration in growth rates, both within the national economies and, of course, within the private equity space. Are you seeing the same kind of trends?
Yeah, I think if you look at the African trends in general, you're seeing obviously the demographic drivers really increased population. They're saying by 2050 Africa will have a population north of 2 billion, which obviously leads to increased consumer spending. I think figure has been thrown about as over $1 trillion of consumer spending by 2020.
Yeah.
So really you're seeing a lot of growth coming through Africa. And that, I think, is really the reason that private equity is starting to focus on Africa in a big way.
Right.
And I think that growth will carry on coming through. And really private equity is a perfect player to help drive that growth and help develop the continent. I think also people talk about Africa as one country, and obviously I think a point to be made is that Africa consists of many different countries with many different opportunities and many different risks.
Yeah.
And each of those countries need to be considered individually, and those risks and opportunities considered individually.
Yeah. Let's talk about who's coming into the continent. Now, we know, of course, South Africa itself has been a source of funding for private equity deals, but there's been interest as well that's been growing from other parts of the world. I think we talked broadly about the interest coming out of China, sort of like it's coming from the state, but there's also been PE activity there and other parts of the world. Let's speak about where this money is coming from. Where are you seeing it coming from?
I think traditionally the DFIs have been the main producers of finance into the continent, and that I think will carry on continuing. We're also seeing that the local savings market is developing. We're seeing a lot
This is in South Africa?
On the continent.
On the continent itself, okay.
Yeah, the local pension funds are starting to look at their own countries in the region, hunting for returns, as well as developing their own countries, instead of deploying capital overseas where the returns are not being achieved anymore.
Right.
So bringing funds back home to really drive that growth in their own continent and their own countries.
Yeah. What about the traditional markets? So your US, your Europe.
Godfrey, if I look at our own fundraising, and we had a very successful close at 1.85 billion of our new MES fund last year,
right.
And I look at our LP base. It was primarily African, Godfrey, and that's what makes us so excited. 14 pension funds, South African, Botswana pension funds.
Yeah.
We weren't too reliant on the foreigners. Yes, we did get a few endowments, family offices and so on from the US and from Europe.
Yeah.
There's a lot of money out there, and you will find people that are prepared to take a punt on Africa.
Yeah.
But I think that really the growth potential for private equity can be realized largely with Africa's own sources of capital.
Right.
There's a tremendous retirement industry in South Africa, but also in other markets, in Namibia, in Botswana, in Nigeria, in Kenya.
Yeah.
All these markets have big retirement industries, and with the proper regulatory oversight and the proper laws, I think that those markets can generate the capital necessary for Africa's renaissance without relying too much on foreign capital.
So you are saying we are actually at the beginning of this cycle. You want to come in, Warren?
Yes, I do. Godfrey, we are definitely seeing our immediate neighbours with regards their pension funds, the government employees' pension funds, extreme interest in private equity. And then our own pension fund, the government employees' pension fund in South Africa, has set aside, we understand, in the region of up to 5% of its total funds under management for private equity. Not only for South Africa, a large element of that will go north as well.
Which is a massive number.
It's
that's
a
50 billion rand.
It's a huge amount. Obviously, they won't spend that all at once. They're going to drip feed it and use fund of funds, etc., to do that. Then there is, if we look at all the funds raised last year, the 8 billion that was raised within South Africa alone, 75% of that came from internal South African sources, which is an extreme change to prior years. So I agree with Luke. We are seeing Africa starting to look after Africa.
How much remains in terms of potential growth then going forward? Because the question that I asked you before we came in here into the studio was just how big this market is. Let's talk broadly about those numbers, but also let's talk about the potential that there is to come. Before we talk about how difficult it is to fundraise, and I was interested in your remark about the fund that closed last year.
Yeah, there's many persons who want to criticize the market have said, is there too much money chasing too few deals?
Yeah.
There is a question over that.
Is there inflation within the PE space?
Is there? And that's a great debate. But if I look at the returns that the market has yielded over the years, and we're talking about a 23% return against the market, the general Aussie of 14%, a significant increase.
You're talking about South Africa.
South Africa at this point.
Yeah.
So there's a significant upliftment in that. And then I speak to my colleagues, for instance, in Germany, and they will tell you that on an average deal, you get up to 50 bidders on a deal.
Wow.
In South Africa, we get 4. In Africa, you might have 2 or 3. So we talk about competition in South Africa or Africa.
Right.
We're not near the levels of our European friends.
Absolutely.
So I don't believe we're at maturity at all, and that there is lots of room and lots of opportunities.
There's lots to grow here.
And Godfrey, the situation's even better for us as a mezzanine player, because we're the only significant mezzanine player on the continent.
Right. Explain that.
Well, perhaps just to go a step back, what is mezzanine?
Yeah.
Mezzanine is really that hybrid source of capital between senior debt provided by the banks and equity provided by the private equity funds.
Okay.
Now, we've probably got 20 plus major private equity funds targeting Africa. We've got one significant mezzanine provider. So we can see the deal flow coming from a broad range of private equity sources.
Yeah.
So from a point of view of a competitive positioning, I don't think we could hope for anything better.
Has it been difficult to fundraise? And I want to quickly come to him, but I want to know from the fund that you closed last year, how difficult was it or how interesting was it?
Godfrey, take a look at all the grey hairs on my head.
I'm battling to see.
That's fundraising. That's what fundraising does for you.
Our private equity clients have without a doubt, across the board, indicated that it's been extremely difficult. There has been a withdrawal or a concern about investment generally.
This is within South Africa?
Within South Africa and Africa and across the board. I'm talking about America, Europe, etc. There's been a withdrawal, a concern, just generally in the investment market. And as a result, a lot of our clients in the private equity space have had to delay or lengthen their fundraising process by 6 months, sometimes up to a year.
Yeah, I mean, it took us 3 years, Godfrey. And just to give you another stat, I was talking recently to a private equity practitioner who is right in the throes of raising his third fund.
Yeah.
He said he had seen 120 prospective investors, and of that 120, there were 5 or 6 that were interested. And this fund manager has stellar returns. So I think the fundraising environment is very challenging.
Which is interesting. Challenging at a time when everybody is saying Africa is the place to be. How do you explain that?
I think track record plays a big part. I think a lot of the players that want to put money into Africa obviously want to see players who have got track record.
Yeah.
What we're seeing, just going back to your comment on deal flow, is that African Alliance's operations locally across 20 countries on the continent.
Yeah.
And we're seeing a lot of deal flow come through that pipeline and that network of offices throughout the continent.
Right.
So in terms of deal flow, I don't think there's a lack of opportunity in terms of competition around that. I think on the larger ticket size investments, there is quite a bit of competition around those, but there are a lot of SME type deals a lot of those deals coming through.
Right.
I think ultimately, as people start exiting deals and proving track records, it'll provide more confidence to the fund providers, and that money will start flowing a bit easier.
Yeah. In the second half, we're going to talk a little bit more about how difficult it is to exit some of these markets in Africa. But your final thoughts in terms of the outlook for the PE industry in Africa?
Yeah, my final thoughts are really is that Africa is the new frontier. I think, as I said earlier, that each country has its own opportunities and risks. And I think the general themes across the continent, you're looking at big infrastructure projects, big energy projects with oil and gas being found off Mozambique, all those projects that we know about, and agriculture. I think Africa is 6% of the world's arable land, with populations that are increasing. A lot of people are going to be turning to Africa for that food security. So a lot of opportunity in Africa, and I think the private equity space is well positioned to take advantage of that growth and of those opportunities.
Absolutely, lots of opportunity to take advantage of in Africa. We have to take a short commercial break, and I have to say goodbye to Nuno Xavier, Private Equity Executive at Africa Alliance. More Invest Africa after the break.